Where is the Brexit dividend? One of the main points of Brexit advantages was supposed to be the idea that the British state could deregulate or regulate differently. So is that happening? Is the British state set up properly to do it? That's the subject of a fascinating new report from the Institute for Government. I'm joined by Jill Rutter, who's one of the co-authors of the report. How do you see this, Jill? Has government started to engage with this question properly yet?
It's engaged in some fronts. So we've seen, for example, DEFRA proposing a radical change in the Common Agricultural Policy, moved out of that. They're now proposing a scheme to move away from payments for how much land you own to payments for public goods. That doesn't count as deregulation. That's clearly something doing differently. We've seen that on migration with the new points-based migration system applying, globally, not just to non-EU citizens. So we've seen some changes, but we haven't really seen very much of the government's agenda on regulation. We called our report Taking Back Control of Regulation. It's, of course, the great vote leave mantra. So far, it's really interesting. The early outing was actually not deregulation at all. It was a proposal to ban live animal exports. That would actually make UK regulation more stringent. And the government pointed out when it suggested that it couldn't do this as an EU member. So I think it's quite important that we talk about regulating differently, not all in one direction. And the really interesting thing for me about Brexit is the potential to test the degree of public appetite. It's been too easy to say all this evil EU red tape, not how we would do it loads better. Government's now got to start to step up and answer that question. And so far, we haven't seen very many answers coming forth.
And so I wrote about this for the Times this week, quoting the report. It was fascinating, the response I got sort of in the comments from some readers who essentially said there is no Brexit dividend, there is no way of doing it differently. I mean, it did remind me, the Brexit wars are still, maybe they're fading away, but they created such bitter divides. It's very difficult to have a sensible, calm conversation about this. But it is also, I think, and I admitted it in the column, it was always a fear of a lot of Brexiteers that when we were asked, what are the specific things that you want to deregulate, point to a rule change, very often we wanted to just move back onto the broad brush constitutional big principles thing. But it's that's what I think is so interesting about the report, that it is the Institute for Government actually really starting to deal with, really dealing with the practicalities here. And you have some recommendations in terms of how people in government departments should be instructed, how Parliament should get more oversight. How would you see it working?
So I think we've got sort of 4 basic recommendations. But I think the thing is, the UK has moved from a situation where, if you like, we were constrained by an EU straitjacket, that the EU set out the standards, the framework and things like that. We've lost that. So we've moved from basically, if you like, what you might call, a bit economicsy, sort of constrained optimization. How do we make the best within this confined rule set? And it's not necessarily just the UK government, it applies to the devolved governments as well. How do we make the best of what we do there? To saying, actually, we've taken away that framework, but now what we've got to do is actually pick our way through, you might say, I think we compare to Space Invaders, but it's like picking your way through a bit of a minefield here, because your task is to maximize the Brexit benefit, the dividend, while minimizing the potential costs. And that's the equation the government always has to have in mind now, that it can do things differently. It can match UK political preferences, as it's doing on the live animal exports. It can tailor things so it reflects, our relative strength in different sectors. We've seen some interesting stuff coming out of the Treasury and the Bank of England on financial services and how to make UK, London, a more appealing global financial services centre. I think that's quite an interesting thing. Life sciences, I think we'll expect to see some stuff on. My nephew has just got a job working for the Civil Aviation Authority in their new sort of innovation hub, where he's drawing up regulations around drones, which is quite an interesting area identified in the government's plan for growth. But what the government's got to bear in mind is, as it's doing that, it's got a set of constraints it's got to navigate. And those constraints are, what will it do to our trading relationship with the EU, either directly by triggering some of those clauses in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the, potentially down the road, the rebalancing mechanism, which could mean, an end to free trade with some tariffs coming in. Staying in line with the EU regulation, we know that we've signed up to the Northern Ireland Protocol, however much David Frost may huff and puff about it. And so Northern Ireland and the UK government on Northern Ireland's behalf is obliged to stay in line with the EU rules. So anything we do to move the UK on goods away from the EU deepens that potential border in the Irish Sea.
And the government is obviously worried or realizes that at some point people who voted for Brexit and all sorts of other people are going to ask, well, what's the plan if there are advantages to having left the EU? Which areas can be deregulated? Where is their scope, whether it be in existing industries or new industries? And they commissioned a report, didn't they, in January from 3 Tory MPs, George Freeman, with a Cabinet Office Secretariat as well. I think George Freeman, Ian Duncan-Smith, and Teresa Villiers. And that's the Tigger Report, which is the task force.
Tigger Report's yet to bounce into our inboxes, which is it's clearly around in Whitehall, because some people inadvertently, when we were doing the report, said, "What do you make of the Tigger Report?" And we had to say, "It's not actually published yet, guys. So you might have seen it, but we haven't seen it." So I think Tigger will bounce into our lives soon. I think it's really interesting, because I think the first thing you said is there needs to be a plan, and that's actually one of our first recommendations. Is that rather than just leave it up to departments and, frankly, the preferences of individual sectors of state to see, I think the government does need a coherent plan. It needs to actually think through, how does it want to balance this sort of, nexus of benefits and costs? So how does it take into account, where it's potentially going to trigger some of the constraints? What's its view of, are things that deepen the border in the Irish Sea a no-go area, or are they up for grabs? Is it going to follow regulatory changes from the EU in any circumstance? That's quite an interesting thing, because one of our big complaints was that the EU was a non-stop sort of legislative machine on a mad hamster wheel, chucking out regulations right, left and centre. That hasn't stopped because the UK's left, and actually the loss of the UK is felt quite keenly by other member states who regarded the UK as a bit of a sort of liberalising, anti-regulatory ally. So the regulations that come out of a non-UK EU may be a bit different. We might look and say, this is looking a bit more French. Do we really want to go there? Because there are consequences of what we call in the report passive divergence, when we just choose not to follow EU regulation. That, of course, applies to European court judgments as well. So the government needs to at least know what's going on there to be taking a sort of decision. Are there benefits for the UK and for UK business of sticking pretty much in line with the EU, because it avoids the costs on business of having to follow 2 UK regimes? Or is this an area where we really, think actually the UK is going to go off in quite a different direction? And I think one of the really interesting things in all this is the feeling from business that actually, we've always had this massive incumbency bias whenever we're talking about deregulation, because the people who've had to invest in conforming to regulation now actually don't want to discover that's all a wasted investment. But people are very much focusing on, can the UK be nimbler, more agile, and actually think about how you regulate some of these sectors for the future, and actually, at least slightly dilute the Brussels effect with a bit of a London effect. Brussels effect is basically the way in which the EU develops a regulatory framework, then uses its power as one of the big 3 regulatory superpowers to impose that on anyone who wants to trade with the EU and export it quite successfully. Can London have the effect that California maybe used to have in the US, of actually getting ahead of the curve and then saying, well, look, guys, this is how we're doing this. We've got ahead of the curve. So here's a model. Why don't you just follow what the UK did? And there are some sectors where we may be disproportionately weighty, where we can do that.
So you mentioned then the economy of the future. This is the part that really fascinates me, because of course there's the existing stockpile of regulation, which, as you explain in the report, the government needs systems for monitoring, where it makes sense to actually deregulate, and where to match, and then how to monitor how the EU is changing things. But in the economy of the future, which if we define that as obviously technology driven transport, you mentioned, autonomous vehicles, AI, life sciences, which potentially are going to boom post COVID, and in terms of medical research, and just that hub effect that the UK has, and the huge advantage it has. Does that require a different approach? And you think you've got grounds for optimism. There is scope there, if the government gets it right, to create something distinct. And I suppose the question people ask is, what will the impact of that be? Can we seriously expect that to increase Britain's long-term growth rate if the government gets it right?
I think it could do, if we produce a good, effective, appropriate but not overly burdensome bureaucratic regimes. I think we could do that. I think we could start to be part of a conversation with other regulators who want to be part of that. Maybe, we look in the WTO at things like the Cairns Group of agricultural nations. I think we could look at the sort of, is there some regulatory cooperation? Because one of the things, quite a lot of these regulatory standards, actually the EU imports them from elsewhere, whether it's, the WHO on health, Basel on financial services and things like that, And I think the sort of interesting thing about our influence in some of those fora, because we have been quite, one of the problems is we have actually been quite influential inside the EU. I think this question about where are we, how are we going to do some regulatory diplomacy, if you like, where we think about how we want to regulate some of these sectors and start to bring like-minded regulators with us. So you could actually imagine, can we sort of have some convening power? But we need to be relatively realistic. The US regulates its ways, likes its way of doing regulations, wants to impose that on the rest of the world. Someone from the EU once said during the negotiations, we're a regulatory hegemon, and we like it that way. We're going to stay that way. Don't think we're going to give you anything. That's one reason why they absolutely stuck out against mutual recognition and any idea that the UK could deliver the same effects through, same outcomes through a different process. China does its thing. So I think it's a really interesting question about where is this? And this is where the government needs to think, actually, where are the sectors where the UK has enough weight, where there is big economic benefits and spin-offs for doing things? Where can we do that? And there will be some. There will be other places, though, where we just actually can fit things to meet our circumstances better. Ministers have always been deeply frustrated by a lot of environmental regulation, which always struck me as very bizarre, because compared to the rest of the EU, the UK is one of the most nature-loving countries in the world. But ministers always thought that this imposes ridiculous disciplines on some of our building rules. Now, have we got a better way of doing that we could do, that manages the need for housing growth against the, I think, hugely British desire for nature protection? I think one of the things that's always rather annoyed me with some of the people like environmental NGOs is the assumption that the political argument domestically for standards was not winnable. You could only win it in Brussels and have it imposed on the UK from outside. And you sort of think, well, actually, and I think the same on things like workers' rights. Interesting to have the discussion on workers' rights and see where we want them and what rights we want protected, rather than to just say, well, we're just champing at the bit and the EU's making us do all these things. Let's have that conversation here about what sort of society do we want to be. And I think actually a better conversation, it might not be enough of a Brexit dividend for you, Ian, but I think a better conversation about those preferences is one of the things that we can now have. Now we haven't got the convenient scapegoat of the EU to blame. So one of the lines I use quite a lot about Brexit is taking back control means taking responsibility. And I think, a better informed debate about some of these things, rather than just putting it all down to stupid EU rules, will be a big benefit. But I think the government should use this year to look very strategically at where, frankly, should the UK just aim to stay in line with EU regulation, because there are too many downsides and not enough upsides from doing things really differently. And where can the UK really invest, and it'll need to invest in the policy making capacity, the thinking capacity, in doing things really differently, that will leverage stuff. The risk is at the moment, it's a bit just like, the Prime Minister always likes talking about whack-a-mole. It's just, can we swat off this slightly annoying thing? Can we do something a bit differently over there? When people have got the time and space to think about it, and you just end up with a sort of messy hodgepodge that actually does no one any favors.
Jill Rutter, absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, it's very simple. Hit the button, subscribe. If you're not a subscriber to the main site, visit the site where you get all of the team's brilliant journalism. You get my weekly newsletter and lots more. And live events are back soon as well. We have me in conversation with Neil Ferguson at the Garrick Theatre on the 6th of July. Tickets are on sale, details on the site. Thank you very much for joining us.